Sea control and sea denial are two of the most important concepts in naval warfare, and in this video I take a look at what they mean. The most important difference between naval warfare and land warfare is probably the fact that you can't occupy territory at sea. So land warfare is very much about taking and keeping terrain, but that's not how things work at sea. At sea, things are much more temporary. There are other logics in place. So the naval counterpart to terrain is sea lines of communication, or SLOCs. And you fight over the control of lines of communication. It's very rare that states go to war with each other over a particular part of the ocean. So naval forces play a different role. What states usually want to use the ocean for is transportation, or they use it to project power from the sea onto the shore. Because ultimately wars are almost always won on the ground. And that's where the concept of sea control becomes relevant. It essentially means that you have enough control over the sea to use it for the things you want to do. And sea denial means that you use your naval forces to prevent your opponent from having sea control. So effective sea denial means that your opponent doesn't get sea control, so they cannot use the ocean for the things they want to do. So in theory, that's very simple, but there are a few things that complicate the matter. The first thing is that the ocean is very large, so it's impossible to have sea control everywhere, and therefore sea control is always a temporary thing that is limited in time and space. It's something that you establish in a certain area for a period of time, and this can be a short period of time or it can be a long time, but it requires an ongoing naval operation to have sea control. So the moment you scale down your naval operation, you will lose the control of the sea. And that's because the natural state of the ocean is that nobody has sea control. This is a point that was made by Julian Corbett, who was one of the early naval theorists. If you want to have sea control, you need to have an ongoing naval operation. And this leads to the next complication, namely that the sea lines of communication can be very long. And the line obviously has to be intact in order to work. So you can attack the sea line in the beginning or in the end or somewhere in the middle. So it can be a pretty big naval operation to protect the sea lines of communication. For example, the United States, it's the greatest naval power in the world. But the United States is also geographically located such that they have very long sea lines of communication to almost any place in the world where there could be a large war. So for the United States, a war would require enormous naval operations so that they can have control along those sea lines of communication, because otherwise they cannot get their forces across the ocean. And this leads to a point about how states have asymmetrical interests in the ocean. So for a country like the United States, it's pretty much all about sea control, because for the United States, any war is expeditionary warfare. But for other countries, naval warfare is more about keeping their enemies away. And they don't actually want to use the ocean for anything themselves. They just want to spoil it for the others. So these countries will choose a sea denial strategy. And these things can, of course, also be local. So, for example, Russia and China can have sea denial strategies for the large oceans so that they can keep the Americans away. And also on a more local scale, they can have sea control strategies for smaller areas where they want to use the sea, for example, to dominate over their neighbors. An important point is that sea denial is much cheaper than sea control. If you want to control the sea, you have to dominate in all dimensions in that area, and that's expensive. But for sea denial, you just need to have some capable sea denial weapons. And that could be things like naval mines or long-range missiles or submarines. And these weapons are not sufficient if you want sea control, but you can use them to challenge someone else's sea control very effectively. But there is one misunderstanding that I want to address, and that is that sea denial weapons are cheap. and sea control weapons are then expensive. For example, I've heard the argument that Russia's nuclear attack submarines must be designed for sea control because they are very expensive. And they are expensive, and they are sophisticated. So, for example, the new Yasen-class submarine is a very capable and impressive machine. It's equipped with Caliber cruise missiles that probably have nuclear warheads, so they can take out an American aircraft carrier with one single missile from hundreds of miles away. But it's still a sea denial weapon. It's a platform that is intended to challenge the US Navy and to spoil the American plans for sea control. So it's not so much that sea denial weapons themselves are necessarily cheap. The cheapness comes from the fact that you need much fewer weapons to do sea denial. So it's much more expensive for the Americans to counter the threat from the Yasen-class submarines than it is for the Russians to build it. But it's still an expensive submarine. Well, that was my explanation about sea control and sea denial. It's two of the most basic concepts of naval warfare. They are wartime concepts, and they really only make sense when we talk about war. But they express some very important points about naval warfare and how it's different from land warfare. On land, the goal of the war is usually to gain the control over some territory, and the war is basically over when you get it. But that's not how control works in naval warfare. Here there is a much more dynamic interplay between sea control and sea denial throughout the war in time and space. And that's what makes it so interesting. Well, I'll end it here. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again next time.